When people think of the historical character of Fairhaven, a lot of times they're not thinking of something that's typical of a little town on the coast of New England. They're thinking of the collection of really outstanding buildings that Henry Huddleston Rogers gave the town. Henry was a native of Fairhaven, and he grew up to be near the very top of the Standard Oil Company. And we owe a lot to Henry for the way our town looks and the character of Fairhaven today. Henry Huddleston Rogers was born here in Fairhaven in 1840. He grew up in a little house on Middle Street that his parents had moved into when they were first married. His parents were Roland Rogers and Mary Huddleston. They were married in 1833. Henry grew up on Middle Street, and if Henry came back today and looked up and down Middle Street, he would recognize it pretty much the way it was when he was growing up. Not a lot has changed on Middle Street over the years. He grew up delivering newspapers there as a boy. He was a clerk for the Union grocery store on Main Street and delivered groceries to his neighbors on Middle Street and Main Street in that neighborhood. And then as he got older, Henry was a member of the first graduating class of our original Fairhaven High School. That was located across Main Street from where today's high school is. Henry graduated in 1856, and at that time, he was working as a baggage clerk for the Fairhaven Branch Railroad. He was loading people's packages and luggage on the trains, and that became his first full-time job after his high school graduation. In 1861, when Henry was 21 years old, word was reaching this area that oil had been discovered in Pennsylvania. A man named Edwin Drake had drilled the first oil well near Titusville, Pennsylvania. They were pumping petroleum out of the ground, and young men with a little bit of money and a lot of ambition could really strike it rich in the oil fields of Pennsylvania. So Henry and a friend, Charles Ellis, left Fairhaven. They each had about $600 savings. They went to Titusville, Pennsylvania, and they started their own little oil refinery. In their first year, those two young men cleared $35,000 profit. It was an amazing amount of wealth at that time. And this was just at the very beginning of the Civil War. Henry soon was selling all of his oil to Charles Pratt, who ran the Pratt Oil Refinery of New York. Pratt eventually hired Rogers to become his general manager, and Rogers worked for a number of years as the manager of the Pratt Oil Refinery of New York. During that time, Rogers and Pratt were fighting against John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller was the head of Standard Oil, and he was trying to buy up all of the independent oil refineries and create one huge monopoly. He did just about succeed doing that in the end. There was a lot of antagonism between Rogers and Pratt and John D. Rockefeller during those early days in the petroleum industry when they were in fierce competition. Finally, though, Rogers and Pratt decided if you can't fight them, join them, and so they merged with Standard Oil. And during that merger in the early 1870s, Henry Rogers was made a director of the Standard Oil Company. Pretty soon he rose to the very top of the corporation. People called him eventually the brains of the Standard Oil Company. He was Rockefeller's right-hand man and worth millions of dollars. In 1896, two economists created a list of the top 100 wealthiest people in all of American history. And on that list, Henry Huddleston Rogers was number 22. J.P. Morgan was number 23, and Bill Gates was number 31. So in his time, at the height of his power, Rogers was worth more money than Bill Gates is worth today. And then he began to give a series of gifts to his hometown, starting with the Rogers School, the Millicent Library, the Town Hall, and we'll be looking at each one of these buildings in more detail as this video series continues. In 1861, Henry married his high school sweetheart, Abby Palmer Gifford. They moved to New York, and they had 5 children. Henry would still visit Fairhaven frequently, and finally, in 1895, he built an 85-room mansion near Fort Phoenix. He would summer there. He would come up on his yacht. He had a steam yacht called the Kanawha, which could sail up from New York City in about 8 hours. And so on the weekends, Henry would load friends and family on the yacht, sail up, and spend the weekend here in Fairhaven, then return back to New York City for the work week. One of the people he would visit here frequently was his friend Mark Twain. He not only became a friend of Twain's, he became Twain's financial advisor and helped rescue Twain from almost financial ruin when Twain's finances were quite a mess. Rogers also helped out Helen Keller, who was introduced to him by Mark Twain, and he gave Helen Keller and her teacher Annie Sullivan a stipend to help put Helen Keller through college. Helen Keller's first book was dedicated to Henry Huddleston Rogers. So he helped out many people besides the people of Fairhaven with his gifts. He was quite generous, but on Wall Street, he was known as Hellhound Rogers. Very, very tough businessman, not liked by everybody in the business world. When Henry died in 1909, about half the nation's newspapers mourned his loss, and half the nation's newspapers cheered that robber baron, Henry Rogers, wasn't around anymore. In Fairhaven, though, Henry was always honored and respected. He was always true to his childhood friends. When he came back to town to visit, he would gather up some of his friends like Tom Tripp, go on automobile rides with him to Mattapoisett. So he was quite well liked here in town, even though in the business world, he was considered to be a very, very tough negotiator and a hard man to deal with sometimes. Mark Twain served as a pallbearer at Henry Rogers' funeral in New York City. Henry's body was brought back to Fairhaven. There was a memorial service at the Unitarian Memorial Church, and then he was interred in a mausoleum in Riverside Cemetery. A monument to Henry Huddleston Rogers was built in 1911, and it was dedicated on his birthday, January 29th, 1912. Originally, that monument stood in the middle of Route 6 and Main Street, but because of safety reasons in the 1960s, after a lot of traffic accidents near the monument, it was decided to move it to the lawn of Fairhaven High School, where it stands today. On that monument, there's an inscription in Latin, and when you translate it, it reads, "To see his works, look around you." And that's true of Mr. Rogers' gifts to Fairhaven. Almost everywhere we look in town, we can see something that we got as a gift from Henry Huddleston Rogers.